So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Allison Lorenz. She is our Executive Staff Officer and going to be introducing our speakers. And we can all thank Allison for putting on the Lunch and Learn series. This is her brainchild, and she's been working with all the speakers to get this lined up. So we really appreciate Allison, and she will let you know about today's speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone, and again, welcome to the Louisiana State Archives. This is our first Lunch and Learn series of our summer and fall schedule. And as Ms. Newsom said, I'm Allison Lawrence, the Executive Staff Officer here, and this is my baby. So I'm really pleased to introduce our speakers today. It's the Archives' very own Mr. Bill Stafford and Ms. Juanita Beth Davis. Mr. Stafford is a native of Washington Parish, but he was raised here in Baton Rouge. He graduated from Southeastern Louisiana University in 1987. After working in the private industry for 14 years, he joined the Archives in 2001 as the Research Library Supervisor. He has conducted genealogical research since the age of 9 and studied history at Southeastern, both of which have been a driving force in his dedication to the Archives and our state for over 20 years. He has assisted numerous authors in historical and genealogical research, as well as been credited in historical documentaries and television programs, such as History Detectives, The Injustice Files, and most recently, featured as a historical researcher on the television series Dead Files. Mr. Stafford and his staff continue to work toward increasing better access to web databases, developing advanced research finding aids, and creating outreach efforts to further promote the mission of the Archives. Archive Specialist Juanita Beth Davis began her career with the Archives in 1999. Since then, she has been the Archive Specialist processing and managing the public vital records collection. She processes all vital records requests from patrons, incorporating statewide and Orleans Parish vital records received yearly from the Louisiana Department of Health and Hospitals Vital Records Registry. She has entered over 2.5 million records, and her dedication and service to locating vital records information for patrons, as well as knowledge of our public vital records program here at the Archives, is unsurpassed in the state. It's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Bill Stafford and Ms. Beth Davis.
Thank you, Allison and Catherine, and thank the administration for the opportunity to speak about this subject. A while back, I started thinking about, what was the legislative history of our vital records? Why are we at where we're at now? Why do we not have certain records during certain time of periods and some during others? And so I kind of did a little legislative historical research and started going backwards. And this is kind of the result of it, and I'll give you an idea of where we're at today and why we have the public records today. First, you have to look at who we are. Louisiana State Archives is the official repository for the state's archival public vital records, which basically means permanent and historical. These records can be viewed through the research library in accordance with Louisiana State Archives' mission of making public records accessible to the public. And then you got to ask, what is a vital record? In records management, a vital record is defined as any recorded information, regardless of format, that is unique to an institution, state department, business, or other like entity, impossible to reproduce and critical to establish or preserve. For our purposes today, vital records are defined as records of life events kept under state governmental authority, including birth certificates, marriage license, and certificates, and death certificates, including stillbirths and still deaths. Although typically considered a vital record, divorce records are excluded as they're generally held at the parish clerk of court office where the divorce was filed. These are a couple examples of your basic vital records. Sometimes they didn't get the best person to do the handwriting. If you ever look at vital records from that time period, that's where Beth comes in and helps, because she can read that stuff very well and had worked for a doctor previously. You see where the type, is pretty easy. When they started getting in, the typewriters were invented in the 1870s, and you started seeing more typing locally, it helped tremendously. And it was a little more resistant to damage, which you'll see later on. The types of public vital records that we have are Birth records, which typically include place of birth, date of birth, gender, race, parents' names and age and residence. Death records, which typically have place of death, date of death, interment site, occupation, spouse's name, parents' place of birth, informant name, race, gender, age at death, and cause of death. Now, you know, I say typically because a lot of times when somebody had passed away, they're older, somebody didn't know who their parents were, where they were from, you find things that are missing in some records. So it's not a guarantee, but it can have any of those. Marriage records typically have place of marriage, marriage date, name of groom and bride, parents' names, officiating, the official marrying the couple, witnesses. And note, the only ones that we have here are Orleans Parish marriage records. For some reason, they came through the public health units at one time, and so the other records, the other marriage records for other parishes are typically kept at the clerk of court level. The state archives does not house divorce or adoption records. Now, why are vital records important? Well, you determine lineage, legitimacy or citizenship, assist in securing employment. They prove legality in contracts or marriages, proves the existence of heirs when wills are undergoing confirmation, confirms age in specific civil and criminal proceedings, requirement for receiving visas or passports for travel, clarifying racial status, a tool for supporting or disproving claims in divorce proceedings. They have a lot of use. You know, we have people contacting us regularly, say for Orleans marriages and those sort of things, where they have to require to have that, or a death record to get benefits and those type of things. So it's not just genealogical. Now, getting into the legislation, the earlier legislation that you see relative to vital records in Louisiana was in 1811, the territory of Orleans at that time. It provided for the recording of births and deaths. It was really the first legislation relative to keeping the records of births and deaths in Louisiana. It required recording a birth within 8 days or within 3 months if distance, illness, or other lawful impediments were determined. A lot of times you're a farmer, you're taking in your crops, you didn't want to come in and do that. The cost was 50 cents fee, which equals about around $11 in today's monetary value, adjusted for inflation. Birth records were to include the date, hour, place, birth, sex, first name or names given, first names, profession and residence of mother, and name to witness, preferably neighbors or kin. That's why a lot of times these earlier records are very useful for genealogists, because they find kin were the informants in those type of situations, or witnesses. And the deaths were to be recorded by the parish judge. The death record included the name, first and last, age, trade, and residence of deceased, name of surviving consort if the deceased were married, widow or widower, names, resident, and profession of the declarant, and if they were related and how. Also, if ascertainable, should contain the names, profession, and resident of the father and the mother, and place of birth, of their place of birth. And 2 separate books were to be kept, one for individuals of European descent and one for free people of color. In 1819, there was a supplementary act to the previous act, which provided the births of all free children and deaths of all free people in Orleans Parish were to be declared within 30 days. If not declared, there was a penalty of $5 to $10, half payment remitted to the state and the other half to the informer. $5 was about $116 in today's dollars, and $10 was about $233, so it was quite a bit. Right before the Civil War, there was an act to provide for registry of births and deaths, provided that all births and deaths be kept in a ledger book chronologically by the parish recorders. Births to be registered within 8 days or 2 months if prevented by sickness or other lawful reason. Birth records to include the day, hour, place of birth, sex, names given to child, father and mother's names, residence, profession, and names of 2 witnesses. Death records were to include first and last name, age, trade, residence of deceased. Also, the names of surviving consort if the deceased was married, widowed, or widowed was included. The names and the residence and profession of the declarant and how they were related was also included. Also to contain the profession and resident of father and mother and places of birth. There was supposed to be a separate book for free people of color with the same information as above. If not declared, again, they were charged $5 to $10, half the payment to the state and the other half to the farmer. Cost was equivalent to a 50-cent fee, which is about $17. Now this is the kicker on this one. It provided that no person out of the parish of Arlene shall be under any legal obligation to have birth or death recorded. The recording of birth and deaths had been compulsory in Arlene's parish since 1819 and discretionary everywhere else in the state. So your little rural health unit out in a parish, and you're not required to do this. So yeah, in those cases, they didn't. After the Civil War, 1874, Act 124 created a Board of Health for the city of Shreveport to define its powers and duties and to provide support. It created the health officer ex officio, the registrar of births, deaths, and marriages of the city of Shreveport. The births were to be reported within 20 days. Birth records were to include date, hour, plantation, town, city, street, number, sex, name of child, name of father and mother, their nationality, age, occupation, and residence. Required names of 2 witnesses. The death records were to be reported within 48 hours, were also by the nearest relative if present in the city of the death. Death records were to include, as far as possible, the date, the full name, sex, age, occupation, residence, color or race, and nativity of deceased, the cause of death, the street, and number. Required that the deceased could not be buried within or removed from the city until a permit was obtained. Those are one of those things that helped kind of get the program going because you couldn't move them or you couldn't bury them unless you had that registration. It provided for the recording of the marriages in that city as well. The fees were provided for, but they weren't listed in the act. Now, 4 years later, Act 110 created the Board of Health in and for the cities of Baton Rouge and Shreveport. Births required to be reported within 20 days. Birth records to include date, hour, plantation, town or city, street, and number. Sex, name of child, name of father and mother, their nationality, age, occupation, and residence. Required names of 2 witnesses. Deaths were to be reported within 48 hours by the nearest relative if present in the city. And the death records will include the date, the full name, sex, age, occupation, residence, color, or race, and nativity of deceased, the cause of death, the street and number, and must show marital status and name of surviving spouse and the name, age, and residence of the declarant. The deceased individual could not be buried within or removed from the city until a permit was obtained. Provided that marriages prior to this time be recorded based on affidavit. Any midwife or physician attending a birth must collect a fee of 25 cents, which is about $7. Marriages were recorded for 50 cents, which was about $18. In 1882, there was an act to provide for the organization of local boards of health and in the state of Louisiana, provided municipality authority in incorporated cities and towns to create local boards of health. Officers were given authority to collect vital statistics and report to the State Board of Health monthly. They were starting to think about statistics, of vital records. This act was largely not followed except in Orleans Parish. And then we get to the reality versus the acts. That's why I kind of buzzed through the acts. The State Board of Health put out a publication in 1904, and it says, and I quote, "It has been a source of much regret to all officers concerned that thus far it has not been possible to secure returns that are nearly enough complete to be of any real statistical value. This is due to some measure to the sparse population and primitive condition of certain portions of the state, mainly to the indifference of physicians and the ignorance of county midwives. Time alone can remedy the former condition, while it is hoped by some modification of law and by enlisting the cooperation of the State Medical Society to arouse the medical men of the state to be more, to have a more active realization of that duty. So basically it says that they didn't do all these things that they were supposed to do. And it was primarily pointed toward New Orleans as far as being required to do it, and not the other little parishes in the rural areas. The midwives weren't turning in the information, and the doctors weren't either. Prior to 1908, attempts were not made to keep divorce statistics at all. Now, then we get to 1914, which we kind of look at as the date where things started happening, and we started getting more records. There's an act further to carry out the Articles of 296 and 297 of the Constitution of the State of Louisiana, and defraying the expense of collecting vital statistics, allowing certain changes to be made in relation thereof, fixing duties of certain officers and of boards of health in relation to thereto, allowing certificates of registration of vital statistics to be received in evidence, fixing a penalty for the violation of this act. This defined the duties of the Register of Statistics, which we currently have, a registrar of vital statistics. Created the fee per death, 25 cents for death and birth, to be paid to the registrar, as well as 25 cents a monthly report. It defined who would pay this fee, and this act noticeably increased the volumes of births and deaths being recorded. Not a lot, but enough to get it started. That's where we kind of say it got started. And this was the biggie. This, in 1918, Act 257, it authorized the State Board of Health to create Central Bureau of Vital Statistics for the registration of births and deaths. So here we go. Well, now we got a central location that can do this, and provided for the methods of regulation and procedure. It established a state registrar of vital statistics, which we, like I said, we currently have now over that central bureau. Provided for proper preservation of permanent vital records. Now that's a biggie. We now are looking at preservation of permanent vital records. It created registration districts and local registrars therein. It required registration of deaths before birth permits were issued. It required undertakers to notify local registrar if death was without medical assistance. A lot of people were waked at home and they didn't have death registered prior to that time. It required every physician, midwife, and undertaker to register with the local registrar of the district, and they kind of kept an eye on them to find out, when they were doing what they're supposed to do. It's considered one of the most significant acts regarding the vital records in Louisiana. Vital records being registered increased significantly after this act. Beth can tell you that. Once you get into 1918, then they're rolling, then things are going on. And then we jump all the way up to 1990 and enacted revised statute 4036G relative to the duties of the State Registrar of Vital Records to authorize certain birth, deaths, and marriage records, Arlene specifically, to be transferred to the state archives and made available to the public, and to provide related matters. The statute itself reads, the State Registrar of Vital Records may, now remember that word, may, annually transfer in the Secretary of State Division of Archives, Records Management and History is authorized to receive all birth records over 100 years old, all records of death, stillbirths, marriage, dissolution of marriage, and annulment over 50 years old, which records shall be available for use by genealogists and the general public. Such records shall not be subject to amendment or alteration provisions of this chapter. So that's really what got them to us. That's when we got involved. Prior to that, we weren't involved with it. And so that's how the act that made them transferable to the state archives. The Act provided for initial and annual transfer of the records from the Louisiana Department of Health Office of the State Registrar of Vital Records, or commonly known as Vital Records Registry, to the Louisiana State Archives. Now, the statute denotes that Department of Health and Hospitals Vital Records Registry makes the decision when and if they would like to transfer the records. It's not mandated by law that they must, but that they may transfer the records. But I'll say that, however, since enacted in 1990, the annual transfer has taken place every year. Sometimes it used to be later in the year, and now it's a little earlier. The Act provided also that once transferred into custodialship of Louisiana State Archives, these records can't be amended or altered by law. That's kind of why you give 50 years after death, 100 years prior to coming here for birth. So the state vital records transfer, typically it happens at the very first of the year. That's why we typically say 101 years for birth, 51 years for deaths and Orleans marriages. Of course, the Orleans Parish births that are over 100, Orleans Parish and statewide deaths over 50 years old, Orleans Parish marriages over 50 years old, Orleans Parish and statewide stillbirths and deaths over 50 years old. After they're received and processed, they become public vital records accessible through the research library by anyone conducting research in accordance with revised statute 4035. Now these are generally the collections here. For the earlier ones, there's really index only for Orleans Parish birth records, index only for Orleans Parish death records, 1808, 1811, 1818. 1819 to 1921, the birth records. 1819 to 1971, Orleans death records. And the reason they go back in Orleans Parish is because of previous legislation that really pointed at them. There's an 1831 and to 1869 index only for Orleans Parish records. 1870 to 1971 Orleans Parish marriage records. 1911 to 1921 statewide births. 1911 to 1971 statewide deaths. All marriage records other than Orleans Parish, as I said earlier, are maintained by the clerk of courts in the parish where the marriage license was purchased. If you want a QR, there it is. If you hit that, it'll get you straight to the index page. This is what currently is online on that index. It's a wonderful online index. You go to our website, you hit historical resources, then you hit research historical records on the left, and then you go to the online public vital records index. And the advanced search is the best. If you're going in there and you're looking for a name like Boudreaux, you don't know if it's going to be a U at the end or X at the end. Just start off BOU and it'll start popping up and you'll start getting returns. If you're looking for a specific year, you can put in there this year and you can even search by first name, although I wouldn't recommend it unless it was a very unique first name. It's a really great resource, and there's over 2.5 million individual indexes on there, and it's hit about, according to my IT department, this website's hit about 600,000 times over the last year, so it gets used a lot. Some of the notable ones. We have marriage record for Kirk Douglas, the actor, in 1942. The marriage record for musician Louis Armstrong from 1919, it was his first marriage, which was interesting. If you look at the handwriting, you start to realize, this is kind of challenging. And like I said, that's why Beth really comes in hand. One time I went back there, and I feel pretty confident in reading these things, and I kept seeing something say, I can't tell where this person's from. And she looks at it and she says, don't know, so so she can read this stuff very, very well. It just comes from years of experience, like I said, working with doctors and also reading the records we have here. Mel Lott, the Hall of Fame professional baseball player, and there's many more. We've got Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, gunshot wounds. You know, when they're electrocuted, sometimes after they're sentenced to death, you'll see legal electrocution. They're very interesting. He was visiting some friends in the Garden District in New Orleans when he passed away, Jefferson Davis. PBS Pinchback, one of the first African-American governors in the state of the United States, his death record. Just to let you know, we have a book about this big of notable, famous and infamous individuals that we've found over the years, and it's very fascinating. Beth found one several years ago. It said stunt writer for a movie, and they were filming a movie, John Wayne, up in St. Francisville, and the stunt writer came on, and at that time you get paid per stunt. He needed the money, but he had pneumonia at the time. He went ahead and did the stunt, broke his neck, and John Ford took the whole production back to Hollywood after that, and he was the best horse stuntman at that time. So you just never know what you're going to run across. We ran across one recently. When I say we, I say Beth. A young man had killed his brother, and it said over pancakes. And I'm thinking, if you want my pancakes, you know, you can have them. I'm not going to fight you that bad. So we find really interesting things in there. You got to look at the disaster impact on vital records as well. Some of the vital records, such as the 1958 death records, were still in New Orleans under the Department of Health and Hospitals during Hurricane Katrina. As such, I've been told that about 200 plus boxes of vital records sustained water and mold damage, such as bleeding and even sometimes removing the ink altogether. We're starting to think it's a good bit more than that. But we get them every day, every year when they have to transfer over. Many of the records are damaged beyond repair, and our staff specifically Beth, tries to reconstitute some of the information from old indexes and some of the old records on microfilm, but they're not all recoverable. And what actually happened is the vital records and vital records registry prior to Katrina were kept in the basement, and I repeat that, in New Orleans, in the basement of the building next to the city hall, and they knew that they were in trouble when Katrina was coming, so they started moving them upstairs, moving them upstairs, and it got to the point where it was go save my family, go make sure they're okay, or save these vital record boxes. And so a lot of the ones on the lower levels were low enough for water to hit them, and it's various ones. Mine may have been damaged, one from the 50s, one from different dates, so it's sporadic. And if they used an ink pen, it can fade the whole thing. If they typed it, it typically came out a little better. But we're trying to capture as much information we can to kind of duplicate those records. There's an example. You notice the type is in good shape, and the writing is totally dissolved for cause of death and other things. Now this is a pretty decent condition. The ones, a lot of them have no information at all, but that's an example of what I'd like to call, Katrina damage. You might ask, can a vital record in Louisiana State Archives be altered or changed if the information is found to be incorrect? No, even if it's factually in error, such records are considered archival historical documents once transferred to the Louisiana State Archives, and they're protected from amendment or alteration under Revised Statute 4036. And a lot of times we've had people come in here and they say, you got my name Thibodeau spelt wrong in here for my grandfather. Well, we can change that in an index, and Beth will put it both ways. He'll put Thibodeau with this, Thibodeau with that, and spelt them both ways, because that's something that we can create. We can't actually go to the document and change it. You'd be amazed how many people would like you to change it, but we can't. Accessibility. Are there public vital records housed at the Louisiana State Archives not accessible to the public? The only public vital records unavailable to the public at the Louisiana State Archives are limited records that are in the conservation lab currently being treated for mold or other preservation concerns. Once they're treated to the satisfaction of our conservator, which we are looking for, and present no threat to the public or the document itself, they typically become available to the public. So, we want to protect the people. We don't want you looking through old documents or our staff even looking through them that have mold and that sort of thing. And we have to make sure that document's in good shape before we make it available. Other vital records collections here at the archives. There's the Second City Court of New Orleans marriages that were not recorded. They're in a book from 1923 to 1944. Calcasieu Parish birth records, 1909, 1911. That's the city of Jennings specifically. Civil births and death registers. There's a collection from Baton Rouge, a collection for Shreveport. Well, that was some of that earlier legislation we saw from 1874 that created that register. The Ascension Parish marriages, 1787 to 1809. Iberville Parish marriages, 1770 to 1798. A lot of times people say, well, how do you have ones prior to statehood? Well, a lot of the colonial records were kept within the parish themselves, and that's where these records come from. The register of out-of-state deaths, one time when there was somebody died that was a resident of Louisiana, when they came back in, they registered them as passing. A lot of people say, are there any other resources for vital records information prior to 1911 in Louisiana? I say, yeah. Sometimes you can find church records that may have registers of births, deaths, and marriages, such as the Catholic Church sacramental records, the Father Hebert's books. Those are awesome records at the local diocese or archdiocese. And those have some great information, and a lot of times they'll even go back into the 1700s. And some of the early New Orleans archdiocese records actually go back to Canada, because that was part of the district at that time, or the parish, I guess you would say. Sometimes it's common to find to post births and marriages in local newspapers and you can find obituaries or funeral notices in local newspapers or local parish libraries or State Library of Louisiana. Those newspapers collections. We don't generally collect newspapers here because it's considered a secondary resource. And sometimes you go into those old newspapers, and at one time they would give out funeral cards. You would give out a card with that obituary on it, and you'd give the people that you knew and your family members. You wouldn't put it in the newspaper, but there may be a social column, and the social column may say, Mr. George Jones died on this date, unfortunately, and we miss his passing. He fell off of a horse. There won't be a lot of information. It won't list his relatives and that sort of thing, but it is possible. Why are there no state parish vital records besides Orleans Parish at the state archives prior to about 1911? Basically, what we went over, the laws in Louisiana regarding the keeping of vital records was primarily discretionary, are not enforced in parishes other than Orleans until the 1900s. A lot of times there just wasn't a reason. Most reasons for collecting those type of records or that sort of thing would be monetary. You had to have or because of taxes and that sort of thing. And they had much important things to do in rural areas, just keeping alive sometimes. You had any questions with anything, or any questions online?
Yes. Are the documents on microfilm or are they digitized?
The vital records, they are currently on microfilm. We are working to get them digitized, I'll say that. And that's a big goal of ours. And you're dealing with a pretty large collection, so about, like I said, a little over 2.5 million. So it would be a big project, but we're hoping to get them digitized. And especially being that a lot of times these microfilm reader printers are becoming out of date and they're not making them anymore. So we do have digital readers in the library, just to let you know, microfilm readers.
Yes, so if we look online, on the online index, and we don't find a particular name that we're looking for, are there additional resources here that we can look for? Or if not the index, is that just the end of the story in most cases?
You want to answer that?
If you don't find it on the online index, generally it means that the record does not exist. But you can always call me and I will double check the microfilm index just in case it got skipped, because that has happened where the person entering just, going down the list, there were 5 John Smiths and somebody got skipped. So I don't ever mind double checking to make sure that we don't find any records.
All right, thank you.
And some of the earliest indexes that we used to use based upon putting our index information in, although now we go directly to the certificate, they were done by the WPA and done by prisoners. Nothing against prisoners, but some of them, so the information, that's why sometimes it's good to check with Beth to follow up so she can check the newer index and see if she can find the records. I always tell people if Beth can't find it, it doesn't exist. I'm just going to tell you that. So, any more questions?
Bill, there's a question.
Sure.
There are some ancestors that I can find in the vital records in the late 1800s, but some I can't find. Orleans Parish, why is that?
In Orleans Parish? It may be a variety of reasons. Not everybody got that information. What would you say, Beth?
I think it kind of depended on the family. Sometimes the family didn't realize that they were supposed to record these records. Sometimes you'll come in and you'll see 6 kids registered on one day, but they forgot the 7th one. And the 7th one is the one you're looking for. And that happens a lot. And especially with a lot of people right now trying to get Italian citizenship, dual citizenship. It always seems to be the person they're looking for did not get recorded. Now, also there's the possibility that the record did not survive to be recorded, whether flood, fire, losing it. I don't know. But generally, if there isn't a record for all the family members, it's because they just never got recorded.
Do you have the census records here?
We used to have them on microfilm. We found that so many people were just going to Family Search for free and searching it, being that they're National Archives records. And so people, personally, if somebody asked me in the library, I would go over to our computer and pull up Family Search and their website, since it is free. If you just get a password and a username. And it's just much easier to search than even our old microfilm. You have to know where you're going. When I was a kid, first got into this, when I was in college, I used to go look at census records at Southeastern in the library in between classes when I should have been studying. And it would take me hours, and I would find relatives and be so excited in rural parishes before I realized there's actually an index for that. But nowadays, through people like Ancestry.com and through Family Search, you can easily do it, But just be careful. Like I have an ancestor that was a Robertson with a T. Sometimes it may be Robertson, it may be R, the misspellings of it, even a standard name like that. So you can imagine what they do with French names. And a lot of times Ancestry got some of their earlier translators of census in Vietnam. And I know that for a fact. And I'd like to see some of the names we have in Akkadi areas, and how they wanted to spell those. So, and Italian a lot of times are challenging in other nationalities. So, and thank y'all for coming. And if you get home and you think, there's something I forgot or whatever like that, you can always get me. I'm in the library here. You can either call, you can email me. I got a card. I'll be glad to give it to you. And any question you got, just feel free. And thank y'all for coming.
I just want to reiterate the same thing. Thank you so much, Bill and Beth. That was really fascinating. I even learned something, so that's great. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. If you don't know, our telephone number is 225-922-1000. So if you are interested in following up, you can call 225-922-1000 or go to the website like Bill said. And so we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thanks so much.